It's a very contentious issue, isn't it? Aquaculture. It's global. It's a massive industry. I certainly get a lot of pushback, a lot of trolling, a lot of negative reactions from various bods in the aquaculture industry every time I post about it, as do my contemporaries. And obviously, there's no smoke without fire. They're defensive for a reason. So I think if we can create awareness around the new fish, as Simon calls it, the farmed salmon, the better informed people are when they want to buy this supposed protein source from the supermarket shelves. Anyway, from one contentious issue to another, what are we talking about this week, Dara?
Well, this is the one topic I think that's got people most riled, energized, engaged. It's the issue of hatcheries.
Yeah.
We spoke about it earlier in the series, but for this episode, we're speaking to Phil McGinnity from UCC in Cork. He's a fisheries science expert, and David Summers, who is a hatcheries manager with the Tay Fisheries Board. But what's been really interesting, I think, Jim, is when you see it on social media in terms of the discussion. This is what's really got people going. Paul Whitehouse and John Bailey earlier in the series were all for stocking.
They lit the touch paper, didn't they?
They lit the touch paper. That's exactly the phrase. So this one we decided, look, let's talk to the expert. Let's talk to somebody who runs one, find out how it works and what the results have been. But let's also talk to fishery scientists to tell us about the science behind it.
And of course, it's a steep learning curve for us as well, Dara. There's hatcheries, there's stocking, there's very different approaches, and they're all incredibly nuanced. And they can't all be lumped together, because this is perhaps what's stigmatizing the process and the technique. It's no longer what it used to be. It's no longer as hand-fisted and as generic, perhaps, and clumsy as it used to be. It's much more scientific and precision-based. I find it absolutely fascinating, and I don't know whether you're the same as me, but I'm certainly a lot more open-minded and forgiving of it as a technique, and potentially supportive even in the right circumstances.
I think for me, Jim, and for the series as a whole, was I don't have the expertise. I'm not a fishery scientist. I'm not running hatcheries. I'm not involved. I'm just an angler. So I don't like to kind of have too strong opinions one way or the other until I learn more about it. So I think this is part of the reason we wanted to find out, well, let's talk to the experts then who are involved in it on both sides of it. So from the scientists to the hatchery managers. Put the case. Tell us how it works.
Let it roll, Dara.
We first built a hatchery in 2003, but the site that our hatchery was on was next door to a hatchery that was run by Marine Scotland, where they had perfected this technique called Kelt Reconditioning. And we worked closely with them. And then it just so happened that in 2011, they decided to shut down their hatchery, close the facility. So we took it over. So effectively, the building that we're in now is a former government hatchery that we've basically kept alive. But the great thing about it is it's got this, as I say, we've taken over this Kelt Reconditioning facility, which has been a real boon to us. You know, our hatchery, like most typical hatcheries, we just took fish out of the river, took eggs from them, and then stocked them out. But with the Kelt Reconditioning, what we are able to do is take fish from particularly, say, vulnerable populations, and we need smaller numbers of fish, take out broodstock. In the first year, we can put their eggs back to where they would naturally belong, but we then feed on the adults. And we can then get these fish to produce eggs in subsequent years. So these are eggs that would not otherwise exist from fish that would have died. And we're able to use those to stock areas that are lacking in salmon, basically.
And can I ask, it might be a painfully obvious question, but actually I'm hoping it's a little more nuanced. To what end? Is it predominantly to help the thriving fishery, the historically iconic fishery on the River Tay, or is it to help the conservation of the wild species in general? And obviously the two are interlinked, but to what end is it why you do this?
I suppose the reasons that we've stocked have changed over the years. Some years ago, I suppose things in Scotland were more, well, there was less regulation of stocking, and what we used to do is that we got eggs from fish, and we often stocked them in places, for example, above waterfalls and this sort of thing, where there were no other salmon. And that was in general to try and create basically more fish throughout the catchment. However, what we are doing now is a much more targeted thing. So with the Kelt reconditioning, for example, a main use that we've been, the last few years has been restoring a salmon population to a river called the River Garry that up to 2017 was bone dry. So there were no fish in this river for 50 years because of hydro abstraction. And then a flow was turned back on. Now, we could have left the fish to try and colonize on their own. And some people say, well, why did you not do that? The problem was that the flow that's been restored is not a natural flow. It's still quite a low flow. And there are big waterfalls on this river that the salmon always had to jump. So I wanted to make sure that salmon could actually get back to the Garry. Because we would all look a bit daft if we got water back and the fish couldn't get over these falls, for example. So what I was keen to do was to stock the river to generate a returning run of fish, and then we built a test out whether they can actually get back or not. So that's what we've been doing, and through Kelt reconditioning, we have been able to produce broodstock or get broodstock from neighbouring natural tributaries, and then produce eggs from the reconditioned fish, and then stock them into the Garry. And as far as we can tell, in the last year, that's been very successful.
When I was privileged enough to be invited to come and have a look at your work there and have a look at that Kelt reconditioning in particular, that was the thing that really that I found fascinating, was how you can bring these spent salmon, these Kelts, back on and resilver them by feeding them, basically, and make them spawning fish again. And you have it's cyclical there, isn't it? You have the same brood stock, which is a reasonably rare way of a hatchery, of how hatcheries work. Can you just tell us a little bit more about why it's so unique?
Yeah, well, as far as we're aware, I don't know if anybody is doing quite the same thing in Britain. As I say, we are lucky that Marine Scotland developed this facility, and they did all the background research, and we've been able to take it over, basically, to save it from closure. And so effectively what we do is we take salmon just before they spawn, because we want them to be in as good a nick as possible. We strip them in the hatchery, and the fish have to be in really good order. And then we start feeding them with prawns initially during the winter. And once they get tamed, as it were, you can then start feeding them with other types of feed, and the fish will then regain their condition and produce eggs the following year. And probably from a group of females that we bring in, the majority of them do actually recondition. It's quite an involved process, but it certainly does work. And I say without this, we would not have the type of broodstock that we need for, say, stocking somewhere like the River Garry, because simply, we'd be having to denude another tributary to restock it. So using this technique's been very valuable. But say what we also do is that when we strip the fish, we take little samples of tissue from them, which are then sent to the University of Highlands and Islands, who basically process the DNA. So we know the DNA fingerprint of all the fish we're stocking into the Garry. And so what we then do is every year in September, we electric fish out, something like 700 juveniles, take fin clips from those, and we can then, or UHI rather, can tell whether they've come from the hatchery or whether they're wild. So the idea is, we once the wild stock comes back, then we'll be able to stop stocking. So that's how we know over the first few years, we can definitely say that the stock fish are surviving and thriving because we know that they are stocked fish. But there are wild fish starting. This only started in 2017. But, over the next few years, we do hope to see a self-sustaining wild population.
I'd just be interested in, Phil, have you come across this kind of hatchery in terms of the way it works?
The only other place that I came up was on the Miramichi in Canada, where there was a push to do something similar. And there was a kind of a governmental review, so that idea that you could actually take smolts even, condition the smolts, bring them through the adulthood, strip them and then recondition them and so on. And there was talk about what might be the issues that would be involved. So so it's a very interesting idea, the technology, but there are some difficulties, and I think Dave's talked about some of them. The idea there was to address a particular problem on the particular tributary. There's low flows. You have to establish a population, and maybe the Kelt reconditioning thing was a good way of going about it. Least impactful one.
Obviously, this is one type of hatchery, of which there are many ways to manipulate the salmon, the brood stock, basically, in order to reintroduce them back into the river. If you had a choice, because, knowing where you sit with the whole hatchery thing, if you had a choice, would you put this one perhaps in the more healthy ways of rearing fish?
All right. So maybe we'll step back a little bit first. So the thing about the hatcheries inherently, they're neither good nor bad. It's the context that you place them in and what you're trying to do. So Dave has talked about a particular issue that he wanted to address there. So you're also interested in the scale. You actually asked Jim a very good question. I thought it was very insightful. So, what's the goal here? Is this to enhance the production of the Tay? And what's in the Tay? I don't know, Dave. Maybe 50 to 100,000 returning fish. Different age groups, the whole thing. To have an impact on that, on that fishery. But you would have an enormous hatchery program. So that the context, scale is important. What you're trying to achieve, and a big thing when you're thinking about hatchery, what is the issue? What is the problem you're trying to address? Is it is it low numbers? Is it to increase harvest? Is it to resolve an issue that Dave has explained there? We said, right, okay, we've restored water flows to the Gary, I think he said. How do we do it? Can we enhance that? We can promote that. And then, as he said, at the end of it, once we have restored the run, we stop. So there's a number of different things going on. So there's questions of conservation there. There's questions of enhancement. There's questions, a whole fleet of questions. So as I said, so when I kind of think of it, so that scale. The other thing is, what's the status of the recipient population like? So in that particular part of the river, there's an issue there. We can resolve that. What's the status of the rivers that Dave's taken the fish from? So that the kind of the brood stock, where's the brood stock sources? Because you can't sustain that. You just can't go in all the time mining out the fish and bringing them into the hatchery. So that's that kind of idea what you're going to use them for. Then what's the chances of resolving the problem? So if it's a problem of barriers, we talked about, if it's a problem of access, if it's a problem of water flows, a problem of water quality, the obvious thing, you need to resolve those things. There's no use taking good eggs, throwing them in after bad eggs, and so on. You're not going to make any progress there. So context is absolute in this, and as I said, scale and location and all these things. And then I think fundamentally, there's a lot of the time when we're talking about these things, it's that about conservation and maintaining production and natural production versus something that you might try to enhance, that you're going to, from a harvest point of view, can we produce more fish than we might expect? So that's a it's a different question. So if the goal is self-sustaining wild populations in perpetuity, the natural capital that is, the physical resource, the state of the rivers, the state of the populations, their integrity, and so on. These are the kind of questions that you're trying to tease those things. You're trying to balance those things. And I think that's the first thing fundamentally you're trying to say, well, what is the goal of this program? And from Dave's point of view there, he's saying, just a very clear goal, set objectives. This is how we're going to address it. And when we've resolved, we're going to do something different. So I think that's very important. So all the elements are there. So if you think of it, think of it in general from hatcheries. So you might say, okay, one situation, maybe an angler point of view, we talked about this a little bit earlier, you might say, well, we want more fish, right? We have the natural production of a particular river is, well, we'll say 500 or 600 fish. We want to double that. That's that's a legitimate thing to say, right? We'd like more fish. Anglers would be happier, we might have bigger income and so on. The other extreme of that is where a population is about to go extinct for whatever reason, water quality. A new barrier is going up, a new hydroelectric plant. There's trouble with interaction with aquaculture or whatever it is. You may have to go in there and say, okay, we're going to have a gene bank. So you're going to save that genetic material, bring it into a hatchery. So hatchery technology is what it's all about there. Good hatchery practice. Can you maintain that as a living gene bank? And the most famous one of those probably is the Gyrodactylus story in Norway, where Gyrodactylus came in from stocking of Swedish fish back in the 70s, 80s. The gill fluke had an enormous detrimental effect on wild populations. What you had to do is you had to take genetic material, just as Dave described earlier, bring it into the hatchery, hold it there, and then wipe out the river. They had to rotten on the river. They had to kill all the fish. And then they were able to use that gene bank to reseed the river. Now, that was fairly drastic, dramatic stuff. But there again, that was hatchery technology. I believe at the moment, up in the Dangar Fjord, because of high levels of genetic integration, they are also now at this gene banking. They're taking remnants of intact natural populations, bringing them into the hatchery, holding them there while they try and resolve the issue. So that's two different extremes. And depending where you fit in that continuum, that's where it is. So quite often hatcheries where, particularly in Ireland in case and in Scotland, is where it was mitigation. We're building a new hydroelectric plant. We're putting up a barrier. You've lost a lot of salmon production, and we will compensate you by having a hatchery program. So that was something different. That was mitigation. That was compensation. And again, the hatchery came in there. A decision was made, socio-economic decision for power generation or whatever. We're doing this. Unfortunately, the salmon have to lose out, but we'll try and compensate. So it's, what I'm trying to get is, it's that, again, it's not the hatchery that's the issue. It's, where you apply it and in what circumstances, and the potential then for difficulties when you apply it inappropriately.
If I can just go back there to other facilities, Phil mentioned something there. Yes, I mean, we're probably, I think, fairly unique in actually reconditioning kelts, but there are other places in Scotland where they do take smolts in to captivity and basically rear smolts to adults in fresh water. So there is that. Although from what I've seen is that the adults that you produce are relatively small, whereas the adults that we have, well, we're taking them in full size wild fish, and then every year they put on some more growth. So our broodstock, in comparison to the small adult thing, are monstrous and well, they're not quite monstrous, that's exaggeration, but much bigger. So they do produce, well, as you know, Jim, as you've seen them. So there are others doing similar things. But I mean, I think a good point that Phil made there, about constraints. There is obviously, a finite amount of these fish that you can keep, because as you've seen, there's a lot of work involved in keeping them.
So maybe a follow up on Dave's point there about that, the scale and the finite, and so in a river like the Tay, where there may be, say, 100,000 fish running, Dave's program there of 200 or 300 fish or whatever, the potential for an impact on the recipient population is, I would say, small. It was small.
Yeah,
so it's tackling a particular area, which is great.
I would see it very much as a tool to resolve particular issues. As I say, and Phil made a lot of good points there. We could not have stopped the Garry because it would have been criminal, as you say, to take fish out of other tributaries and just to feed it, because it would be making them worse. But I say what we're able to do is that in the first year, we put the eggs back to where they would have been approximately. So we're trying not to denude these other tributaries. But because we're then reconditioning the fish, the eggs that we get subsequently, we're treating these as eggs that would never have existed. So if they die, for example, where they not that we want because it's a big investment, but where they die, it would not actually be a loss to the wild. But as I say, from what we've found, because we're intensely monitoring this thing, is that certainly in somewhere like the Garry, by stocking, you can't generate a juvenile population. But at the same time, we are seeing at the bottom end of the river fish that the genetics tell us, have come from wild parents. Maybe fish that we stocked in years before, that their progeny is coming back, of course. And so, one thing that stocking has taught me is that there are some places that you stock, and for whatever reason, fish just don't do well, some burns. But some places they do. And you don't actually need to stock a huge amount to actually get really a good juvenile population. And with the same corollary, the same thing will be true of wild fish too, So, what we found in the past is that stocking really only works with us. Well, certainly stocking in eggs or fry or whatever, if you're putting them into somewhere where there's no other fish, basically, So, and Phil is absolutely right. I mean, if we were going to try and stock the whole Tay with a hatchery, it wouldn't make any difference at all. It really wouldn't.
Some fascinating insights there from you both. And I suppose from a purely selfish salmon angler perspective, 2023 was a disastrous season. And David, you're probably starting to hear a lot of rumours in terms of a lot more rivers, maybe fisheries are looking at and considering hatcheries as an answer to try and increase or boost or help the numbers of salmon. So in that context, and seeing, there's so many questions around this, I'll start with you maybe, David, and then Phil, just get your thoughts on it. Would you be concerned, David, that there's too much of a kind of maybe a rush to kind of thinking, okay, hatcheries, look, we need to examine hatcheries, that this is some kind of an answer that we need to kind of propose now and start examining to try and help the salmon angling perspective?
Well, certainly here, I mean, we've had probably the worst season ever in 2023. And although, because we obviously already have a hatchery, I haven't detected a big clamour locally for enhanced hatchery work. There may be, but certainly, I haven't heard. But I am aware in some other rivers in Scotland, people are considering hatchery work, not actually so much to try and enhance the salmon population, although that's maybe what anglers are imagining. But I do know that there are people out there, fishery managers in some other rivers, who, like Phil was saying there about Norway, are actually concerned because they've got so few fish in some parts of the rivers. They actually think, well, what are we going to have to do to save them? So we have people here who are interested in things like gene banking, etc. But it poses a big problem because the problem that we're dealing with is high marine mortality, which may well be due to simply just down to climate change. So if you're going to do that, well, how long are you going to have to hold these salmon for? Well, maybe never, because if we don't actually get real about climate change, then this is all pretty academic stuff.
Phil, do you think there is a danger sometimes in terms of a clamour to kind of say, we've no fish, we need a hatchery, we need more anglers, let's increase the numbers?
The possibility is that you do more harm than good, and I think they've said it out very well there. It's about resolving what's causing this decline. Joe, in your particular river, say you were in the Dodder or whatever, what's the reason for the decline? So that's the first thing. So it's this I'm back to the very start of this. It's about the context. What's your expectation of success? What are you trying to achieve? What is the background situation? If this is about climate change and so on, you're talking about global resolution of those kind of issues. But it could be something like water quality. Like if you take in Ireland, for example, I think the latest EPA report was saying that 50% of the waters in Ireland probably aren't capable of holding salmon. If you see, the odd time I'm looking at Twitter and I see Fergal Sharkey talking about different, down in England, down south of the border there, what's going on with sewage works and water quality and so on. Like, you can't have it both ways. Salmon have a very, very high habitat requirements. They need access to clean water. They need clean water. These are the things. But these seem to be fundamental things that can be resolved. Now, you're very lucky in Scotland, David. So, a lot of clean water, a lot of it is accessible and so on. But that's not the same right through the distribution. So, things like that, they're first principle things. Clean water, good habitat, access to habitat. Hatcheries, like when we're talking about, self and David talking about gene banking, you're into the last, couple of fish. And you have an expectation that whatever issue it is that you're trying to protect is going to be resolved. So that was the Gyrodactylus, which was justified. Well, we think we can fix that. The integration issue, well, that's going to be that's another question, how that's going to be fixed. But if you can't do that, it's no point bringing them in the hatchery, because when you bring the fish into the hatchery, you start to change them. They're a very different animal. Their fitness is considerably reduced. And if we go back even to Dave's Kelt Reconditioning, and he's probably, because he has the University of the Highlands there, probably giving him some good data about the genetics. But not all these hatcheries are going to have access to genetic information. But you get into situations of you're sampling. So you're taking a small sample out of a population, and then you're expanding it. If you're successful, you expand that. So you start to reduce the variability. You have big chances of inbreeding. You're doing the sexual selection. We're ignoring sexual selection. So there's a whole range of genetic things that I might think of it as an evolutionary biologist that might be important there, that is going to impact on the fitness. And then, he resolves a particular problem. He draws fish in. Very good. But if, say, you had a small river with 200 or 300 fish, you can have a big change with the hatchery. If you start to say, I'm going to ranch fish, and then you've got the numbers of fish that come into the system, or as many as there were there, you have a big chance of having big genetic changes and ecological changes on the population. So there's a lot of risks associated, and it's what appetite you have for that risk. When you're starting to think about, is this a plausible strategy?
My mind was racing because we were talking about this the other day, Dara and I. Where are there examples in the world of full-blown purely hatchery rivers, and that you could deem successful depending on what that meant, and whether they had achieved their goal? And then you look at some of the rivers in Iceland, perhaps, and you look at the Rangas, and you go, well, okay, they're hatchery rivers, and we know that's a unique situation, that the riverbeds there were covered in lava, so they suddenly became uninhabitable for spawning. But you have a huge population of salmon there, and a healthy head that serve the anglers, and the tourism that comes off that. Now, if we're with an angling cap on, if we're looking at these Scottish rivers, and if, God forbid, the trajectory continues, not just in Scotland, everywhere, and the salmon are dropping off the cliff at an accelerated rate of knots, and there's a lot of ifs and buts here, but just bear with me, and the government allow legislation through that, you pretty much, depending on what the prerequisites are, you can ranch a river, you can ranch it to the same extent that they did have and do in Iceland. What would your reaction be to that? And what would your caution be to that?
You mentioned government there. Like, what's a government trying to do? What's from an advisory? Say I was a public servant, I was advising government. So what they're trying to do, I would think they would probably have a conservation hat. They're both fisheries and conservation, but say from a conservation thing is, what is the salmon resource? Each river has its own distinct genetic population. Many of them have multiple populations and different, as in the Tay, different run types, different sea ages, and so on. So there's a resource there that you're saying, okay, all those animals, we want to protect all those animals. This portfolio effect. I don't know whether you're familiar with this idea. I think it's a very good way. The portfolio effect is, stocks and shares. Jim, you probably have a lot of stocks and shares and properties and all sorts of things. You've diversified your portfolio of assets, and you have some property, and you have some shares, and you have some cash. And in a way, the salmon game's the same. There's this portfolio of populations of genetic diversity, each river. All those elements are incredibly important. So as a public official, as a government, I'd be wanting to protect those. That's the first goal. That's to conserve those, because that's your natural capital. That's how you're going to keep this thing going into the future. When you're tired of your fishery, you might want to have the fish. Who's going to look after the fish? So you're going to protect that portfolio. And just an interesting one that involved climate change. Very interesting study many years ago, or a couple of years ago, on Bristol Bay in the Alaskan salmon, Bristol Bay fishery, and they were looking at this idea of this portfolio, because I don't know, there's a couple of 100 million salmon run there, but the populations that drive the run changes over time. So they were able to see certain populations that at one stage of this PDO, the Pacific Decadal Oscillation, just the oceanic conditions, population A, fantastic or very low production, population B, fantastic production. But as the situation in the ocean changed, population A then became the big producer, population B. As a manager, and I had no value of population A, and say we put a big hydro, we would have lost all that production into the future. So it's that idea, Joe, if you think of that, Joe, so that's what you're trying to conserve and preserve. Now, as an individual fishery owner, then you might say, well, we want our river, we need fish. That's all right, that's all great stuff. But just come back on the Oranga. But the Oranga, there's a logistical part of this too. Like the Oranga, I don't know, 500,000 smolts or maybe 250,000 smolts. That costs money. Like, there's money, there's infrastructure. Not everybody can do that. And there was no, as you said, there was no salmon population there. So you're not getting into this. Now, there could be strain and different things, but there's no. So that's a different issue. So it's that, Joe, what's logistically, what's financially feasible? But from a government point of view, they're saying, well, this resource is in common ownership. So everybody has some sense of the value of salmon, whether that's cultural or economic or iconic and so on. So that would be the advice. So then when it comes to say, well, my river, what about my river? Well, then the issue is, I'm looking at your river and I said, well, you need to protect that resource. It is possible by establishing this hatchery program, that you may compromise that resource. So that would be the advice.
I'm really conflicted in all of this. And as I've said,
throw it out there, Darren. Let's resolve the conflict.
I feel like I'm on the therapy table here. I tell you what it is. At what stage, like we look at the numbers and the fall off of numbers, and it's been downhill, and it's and it's man-made, right? It's climate change, it's aquaculture, right? If there was no such thing as salmon angling, right, and if it was a pure conservation issue, we keep going at this. We keep trying to chisel away. We keep trying to educate people. We keep trying to change behaviors, industry, all that kind of stuff. At what stage do we actually go, do you know what? That resource that you spoke about, Phil, that's lovely, well and good. Yeah. But let's just accept that in a certain amount of rivers, game's over, right? And let's give up the ghost. And let's just focus on hatcheries and rearing of fish that we can actually accept that. Can we have both sides of the equation, I suppose, is what I'm trying to... Can I have my cake and eat it, please?
You want to ring fence rivers off, don't you? Those rivers are for fishing and these rivers are for protecting the wild stock.
If I can come in, we often get asked, or did in the past, we often get asked, why can we not do what they did at Ranga or Delphi or wherever? And some years ago, I had a look at data from, in fact, Phil's old place at Borashul and Delphi and these places where salmon ranching was undertaken. And what it was quite clear to me was that in the Irish examples, there were in some years the thing would appear to have broken even, right? In Ranga, it probably broke. It may well have broken even all at the time. In Ireland, it broke even some of the time. But what was quite clear was that when you had a very poor year across the board, then the hatchery fish did particularly badly. And if you look at underlying marine survivals, I haven't looked at this for a few years, so I'm talking about data that's 10 years out of date. But up until relatively recent times, there was a monitored river in Iceland that had marine survivals of the order of 20%. right? Now, our marine survival here at the moment might be nearer 0.5%. That's a sort of concern. And so we would have to go back to the 1970s to have marine survivals that were equivalent to what they have had in Iceland in recent times. So the problem is something that works away further north simply wouldn't work here. As Phil said, you could pour in vast amounts of smolts, and smolts have been stocked in various places in Scotland in the past, and the return rates have been really, really poor. And the likelihood is that if you did it now, it would be even worse. So the problem is that the smolt stocking at the present time just wouldn't work here. And that so there is no alternative. The only alternative would be to rear fish right to adulthood of whatever species and fish for them, because that's the only way you can control the environment. So do you want to fish for rainbow trout instead of salmon? Basically, and that's I think is a big issue that we can't get around.
I think Dave's put it very well there, because in a way, lads, it's back to yourselves as on the angling fraternity. Like what is it? What are you striving for? What's your expectation? What do you appreciate? Is it catching a wild fish in a wild environment, or is it is it some other version of that has been enhanced? So it's also about managing expectation. And the thing, Dara, too, is if there are fundamental issues in the ocean and in freshwater, the hatchery isn't going to it's not going to do it. It's still going to have to respond to those particular conditions. So the condition. But I thought there was a very good point you were making earlier. And I thought you were going to come at it. You're competing for water, Dara. I think you're saying, if we sort out X, Y, and Z, but we're not sorting out X, Y, and Z. Water quality is continuing to deteriorate. So access to rivers has not been reestablished. Aquaculture is competing. There's integration from farmed populations. There's a range of different things going on. So it's really a socio-economic or a philosophical thing. What do people appreciate? What value do they put on salmon, even from a conservation point of view? But also, and I don't think there's any conflict between from the angling fraternity. It's good for both.
I look at habitat and I think that's manageable, Phil. Right? That's controllable. There's knowns there. Okay, it's measurable. We know. Okay, there's measures there. Right? Tell me from a scientific point of view, because I've spoken to kind of other fishery scientists, and you get this impression of we actually don't know what's going on out in the marine survival. We don't have the answers to it, and I just get that feeling of, because it's still so much question marks out there, that we're just fighting a losing battle on it either way, whether it's for the wild fish or whether it's for stocked fish going out. That marine survival is so bad that we're just fighting an uphill battle on it.
So I want to keep you positive.
Please.
Dave Summers here.
I'm worried about
my
him.
heroes here. Yeah, but this is important. David Summers here is one of my heroes here, because when Dave was doing his PhD, he did some just absolutely fabulous work about some of the East Coast Scottish rivers and their productivity in the past. So we quite often look, from the 70s to the present, and it's just declined. So it's drawn a line down the thing, just to a disaster. And but if you actually look prior to that, back into the late 18th or 19th century, and then into the early 20th century, there was periods of very low productivity, maybe as low as we currently see. And then I used to love going back to this. I think it's stuff from the 1760s, some of the big commercial fish. And it's probably, well, not an order of magnitude, maybe 3 times the production of the 70s. There was incredible. So the first thing is, it's variable anyway. Right. So it's not unexpected to me that you have changes in the ocean that are going to have impact on the population. The problem now is, how much do you attribute that to climate change? Just greenhouse gases and global warming and so on. Changes are occurring. Any of it's not that we don't know. We know changes are occurring right through the different trophic levels, from plankton, zooplankton, juvenile fish, right through to the top predators, which salmon would be one of them, right through the pelagics. Right. So that we know that capacity is there. So, so there is a decision to be made, again, a social one. Do we continue to warm the earth? I think there was something on the television yesterday that the UN or the WHO or wherever, that we're actually going beyond that 1.5 degrees. We're into 2 degrees, potentially 3 degrees. That's where we're at, lads. That's
the problem.
Context. That's the context you're playing in. But, however, you're not helping it by adding hatchery fish into the mix, or putting sewage into your rivers, or mixing up your genetic stuff. That's your natural capital. If you don't protect that, you've no chance.
Just running with your analogy of stocks and shares and assets and finances, it's kind of what we're saying. What I'm hearing is that you can have all these different assets and spin all these plates to try and grow your capital, but if the bank in which your money is in is screwed or it doesn't exist, i.e. the environment itself, due to...
Or you consume the resource.
Yeah, exactly. You've consumed the resource.
If you consume it, you only get it once if you consume it.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, if you look after it, it's there in perpetuity. That's what the point I was going to make is, at some stage then you walk away from this and that portfolio was left in tatters. So in a way, this is what you're trading off. You're trading off risk and benefit all the time.
So running with that analogy, if we do, let's say we walk away from it. I mean, I'm zooming out over a period of maybe 100, maybe 200 years, if God forbid we get that long, and temperatures increase, and we've tried, but we've let the salmon down ultimately, and a lot of these river systems, the wild stock become as close to extinct as they, or indeed extinct. But if what you're saying, and I tend to subscribe to that theory too, that if you go back centuries, it's a very cyclical thing, and there have been periods in time where we have had catastrophic collapses of salmon stock, probably Atlantic salmon stock, and I'm sure Pacific too. They are an incredibly adaptive, incredibly strong, incredibly resilient species, as we know. Do you, obviously not in our lifetime or our children's lifetime, but is this fish going to find a way to keep on living in one way or another?
The things that we're seeing is that, well, and I mentioned at the beginning that the Tay was famed for big fish, right? So, for example, a lot of these really big fish, there was a really good period for big fish in the 1920s. That's when Miss Ballantyne caught a 64-pounder. But in those days, 40-pounders, I'm not saying that every second fish was a 40-pounder, but, 40-pounders were caught every year. But if we were to go back to about 1900, for example, in a lot of the bigger rivers, or the more lowland rivers on the east coast of Scotland, for example, like the Tay and the Tweed, had strong autumn runs. Right, and a lot of the good fishing was, say, in September, and these were for fresh run fish. But in the 20s, really after the First World War, for whatever reason, and it must be oceanic because it happened everywhere, basically these autumn fish disappeared. And in fact, it wasn't just autumn fish; there was just a lack of grills. And what you tended to have was catches dominated by high sea age fish. Now, if you were on the D, that meant mainly 2C winter fish, but with us, presumably for genetic reasons, for a particular strain, we had a lot of bigger fish, a lot of threes, particularly in some of our upper tributaries. But when I came here 25 years ago, if somebody caught a 3C winter fish in the spring, say a 20-pounder in the spring, that was actually talked about in the Tay 20 odd years ago. There were just the odd 3C winter fish at that time. And we had our main fishery was for autumn fish again, autumn grills in September and October. So the thing between the 20s, in the 1980s, 1990s, it had completely flipped. But what we saw in 2016 was that these autumn fish just at once disappeared. In 1 year, they vanished, and they've never appeared since. We've had, in the last 5-6 years, we've had no autumn fish to speak of. But what has been happening is that and with time, first of all, it was just a feeling, but looking at with catch records since about 2008, and it's a bit bumpy and it's still low in historic terms, but our spring 3C winter run has been steadily increasing for the last 15 years or so. So we're actually seeing fish that are staying at sea for longer, effectively, until they mature. So these are presumably fish that are traveling further north, so that the grills have sort of copped it. We're not seeing the grills, and we're not seeing cotton fish. What we are probably seeing more of too is we're getting more sort of summer 2C winter salmon that are coming in, say, June and July. And I suspect that these are fish that have taken over the habitat that the autumn fish in the main river used to take. And the thing is that these fish have a different behavior from the grills it used to run in the summer, because the summer grills tended to come from upper tributaries. But we're now seeing certain beats in the lower Tay, not the lowest beats, but beats just above Stanley, that some years ago wouldn't have done very well in July because the fish then would have shot through them. But they're now becoming the epicenter of Tay fishing at this time of year. And people haven't worked this out. Folk haven't quite got their head around the fact that this is altered. And so what we've now got is a run of fish that come in the summer, that come into certain beats in the lower Tay. They sit there. And now, a few years ago, I thought with the loss of the autumn fish, that was the fishing model broken. What were we to do? But actually, what's now happening is that these fish are sitting in the main stem, and anglers are now fishing for them at catch and release as coloured fish in September. So in actual fact, we still got, it's not the same as it was, but we've still got people coming and fishing for them. So the whole kind of culture has changed. So in actual fact, these main stem spawners, by coming in earlier, as it were, has actually lengthened the fishing season for them. Strangely, but to say, there are winners and losers in this. There are some beats, that aren't catching the fish that they did 10 years ago, and there's a few that are actually doing better as a consequence in the summertime.
You just get that sense of panic, maybe despair with anglers from 2023 season, like as Gilly was described to, falling off a cliff was the phrase that they used to me. Phil, do you worry about that? And David, I'd also ask you about that in terms of just how much we've gone past the point of no return or little return.
Well, I certainly think that in the last few years, we have sort of bumped along 4,000 or 5,000 fish, which is, a third of what the Tay was producing 30 years ago. But still, the fishery is still a viable fishery operating at that level. This year has been down a notch. Now, obviously, I just hope this is a bit of a one-off, and it does pick up again. But if it does keep going down, then well, who knows what then happens? So we can't really. I think that if it drops much further, then we are into difficult territory. Up to now, everybody's been concerned, but things are still. We still had a fishery, but if it keeps going, if it keeps declining, then we are in difficulty.
And would that have a bearing, I'm assuming, on your work at the hatchery, David?
Well, it would, in the sense that, our hatchery is all funded by levies on proprietors, or we over the. In fact, we would never have had the hatchery had it not been for very, very generous donations, particularly from John Apthorpe, who's an owner of quite a bit of fishing on the river. and otherwise we would never have been able to maintain it. But if income stops coming in, and this is, and you did say a point earlier about, anglers being interested, that if there aren't people coming to fish and people paying, then nobody will really care about salmon. I think if there weren't anglers really concerned about them, because, largely most of them go unseen, and I think that, rivers would suffer worse as a result, definitely.
David illustrated the whole thing about the portfolio effect very nicely there. But the capacity, the resource was there within the Tay there, Joe, for different stock units, under different conditions to do better or do worse or whatever. That's what you want. That's the capacity. That's the resilience. You want to protect that. So you don't want to do something inappropriate, whether it's to build a barrier or to pollute a place or bring in a hatchery practice that's inappropriate, that compromises that capacity for the fish and the fishery to adapt. So that's what you're trying to do. You're trying to protect that capacity to do it on its own, more or less. If man wasn't involved in it, could those populations sustain themselves? Not artificially, but naturally. And you asked that earlier, from a government point of view or conservation point of view, that's what you're trying to build in that resilience, protect that portfolio. Because if you put all your stocks and shares into property at the moment, it might be so good, or whatever. So that kind of idea. But yeah, so I think that was a good point of the capacity and the capacity of natural populations. So, for example, a project, I don't know, you may be familiar, work I was involved in here in Burrishoole. So for many years, Burrishoole was one of the first places where this smolt ranching technology was applied. So back in the 1960s, they took fish out of the wild, put them into the hatchery. They were able to feed them up, like the reconditioning and so on, and then release them into the wild. And then they would home back, Joe, the fidelity of the salmon back to its home in there, so home back. And that was great. And the numbers started to go up. And there was a period of time then where they said, Joe, there was no concept that a hatchery fish was any different from the wild fish, or particularly a hatchery fish from a particular river was any different from the wild fish. So they used to let the fish up to spawn in the wild, no problem. But numbers started to go down, continued to go down. And at one stage, I was looking at the contribution of hatchery eggs in the population and the numbers of wild smolts being produced naturally from that natural spawning of hatchery fish and wild fish together. And it looked like the more hatchery fish you had in the population, the less production you were getting. So it was having an impact on the productivity. So I was thinking about that. But what was worse, when we started to look at the climate data, it had a bigger impact with the winter. During a warm winter, there was a bigger impact. So if you had a warm winter and a lot of hatchery fish spawning in the wild, you had even less production. So it was that relationship. So here you were actually compromising the capacity of the wild population to sustain itself in a period of climate variability, or warm winters particularly. And you can imagine warm winters are interesting in that, the egg is in the gravel, and they're cold-blooded animals, and the warmer it is, the more energy they're using up, and they hatch early, and then there might not be any food for them because, different organisms, the microinvertebrates, the insects are on a different schedule. So you've got this mismatch between the fish and their food and so on. So that might have been the likely technology, the difference. And a lot of what we thought was to do with egg size. So when you bring eggs, fish over a number of generations, the eggs start to get smaller because there's no penalty for being small in a hatchery because there's loads of food, like every amount of food. So the eggs evolve. So more eggs is better, smaller eggs. However, in the wild, that's not good. Small egg isn't great in the wild. You want to be bigger egg, more food, more sources, that kind of stuff. So in a way, that's one trait. Think of all the thousands of traits that an animal that's living in the wild in a cold water, metabolism and its immune response and its growth rates and its behavior against predators. All these are the things that when you bring them to the hatchery, you relax that selection for those traits, or you direct the selection for traits that are good in the hatchery but are not suited in the wild. So, that kind of idea. So that's where we're at when we start to think about these things. So you're trying to minimize the risk and have the impact that you wish.
I mean, these fish that we all love so much, and fight for on an hourly basis nowadays. The damn things are so sensitive. As brilliant as they are in sense of evolution, they are so sensitive and so contingent on so many things that the very thing that made them what they are is also their downfall, as is often the case, right? And it sounds, listening to you both, like I feel a little bit certainly more informed and educated about hatcheries. And whilst they have a place, it's incredibly specific, depending on the context and depending on the goal of what you want to achieve with these hatcheries, and what they're certainly not. And David, I think you'll agree, is by any means a silver bullet for the much bigger issues that are going on and challenging the wild stock. We ask our guests some pretty big meta questions towards the end of our conversation, and we'd like to move on to that now. It feels like a natural place. So, to save the wild stock, if we could, what needs to happen? If you were furnished with $1 billion or euros or whatever, what would you do with it? First of all, this goes to you, David.
Well, as far as the Tay is concerned, if money was no object and regulation was no object, one of the issues about our catchment is that just because of the geography of the place, we have lots of tributaries that have got natural waterfalls in them. Some cracking salmon tributaries or would be that fish can't get up, basically. It's very clear to us that in the main stem of the Tay, some of the best beats, are where productive tributaries come in, you see. And so we've got some parts of the Tay system that salmon can't get to. And so if you're in the Tweed, for example, all of these places are accessible, but with us, they're not. So I think that, so the first thing I could do if I had ultimate power was to say, right, let's open up some of these places so you've got more habitat. And that would make a big difference. So somewhere like Dunkeld, for example, there's a river comes in there, the Bran, with a fall in it. You could make that possible using a sort of Borland lift or something, tunnels or whatever. And at the Hermitage there, you could make it the best salmon leap tourist attraction in Scotland. This is all feasible. So I would do something like that. That would be one thing. And I would probably need an awful lot of money because I'm not sure whether they would be for sale. But we have got lots of hydro dams in the Tay catchment. And if I could afford to buy them out, some of them, I would be quite interested to see them removed and see what happened then. There's been a lot of human impact through hydro and other things in the Tay. So these are the two big things I would do in a Tay catchment if I had stacks of cash.
What about you, Phil?
We're actually working on a project at the moment. We're trying to quantify how much of the European river network is compromised. This is a build on from the Amber project. You may be familiar with that. The 1 million barriers impeding the access of diadromous fish, or fish that need to go to the sea and so on, right across Europe. And it's just so Dave's point's well made. That's one of the first places you would start. Now, there's a difficulty. Dave's we're only going to, after agreeing all along, we're probably going to fall out about this. No, we're not actually. But I was very much, when I was a young biologist and getting into the salmon game, I was very much, let's open up a few bits. I actually opened up some of the borders myself, different things. But since I've been criticised, well, it wasn't. It was a good point. Well-made point is, quite often in trout, above waterfalls, you will have quite very distinct entities living above those. These are fish that came in 5,000, 6,000, 7,000 years ago before this isostatic lift. So there's quite unique populations above waterfalls. So when we open up those waterfalls, we can have a big ecosystem effect on those. So I would distinguish maybe between natural barriers and the ones man. I think, Dave, by the time you're $1 billion, I don't think your $1 billion would go very far if we could even get those hydros out first. The second one then is the water quality thing. Is, we're going to have to do something about this. That's something in our control. Pristine waters. It has to be, so there's a thing. So really, I don't know whether this is 1 million or 1 billion, but we have to change people's mindsets. As a society, we need to value our rivers, and the animals that live in them. We're lost, Dara, you were asking me about, the big existential questions there. But if we don't appreciate these rivers, that physical thing, a healthy, connected river that's connected to its floodplain and everything else, where are we going? We're lost. Same with the salmon thing. We want to protect that resource. So that's a societal thing that's going to be incredibly important.
Well, that actually maybe ties in with then the next question we always ask is if you had no money, what, in terms of what can we do today to, advise listeners? What can they do?
Come on podcasts with no money. Agree to do these kind of things, because really that really is what it's about. It's education. And I think the likes of yourselves guys are doing a phenomenal job. And I see some of the stuff on the television there. That's what it's about. People connecting with, more and more we're disconnected from our environment. It's about reconnecting. And I think that's where the appreciation comes into the thing.
And you, David?
Yeah, well, I mean, at the end of the day, money is pretty fundamental to a lot of what we can do. But at the end of the day, it always seems to me, and Phil has hinted at this, and I keep telling people that often a lot of our job is actually, we don't have a huge amount of influence ourselves, but it's trying to influence people that do. Governments and agencies and regulators. So you can do that if you're clever, without a vast amount of money. So what you want to be trying to do is to leverage the knowledge and the skills that you have to get people who do have more influence to start changing policies. As Phil has explained, for things like water quality or whatever, fish passage. Because these are all issues that are under somebody's control.
I think it's very important when we think about these things from a societal point of things. Rivers, they fulfill a lot of functions. There's a lot of competition for water. Just think of it. Energy, utilities, water treatment, drinking water, basic fundamental thing, drinking water, agriculture. So everybody's competing for that resource, and it is a finite resource. So that's what it's about, Joe. How do you balance those things? So you're really into the world of politics, socioeconomics. These are key things, And this is a bit worrying on this one. Is, say, in terms of the future, you're probably hearing all the time now on radio and at a policy level, adaptation, climate adaptation. And in the fisheries world, naively, I was thinking, what's climate? Climate, that's brilliant. We're going to really, with this climate change thing, this could be really good for fisheries. So that's not necessarily the case. Climate adaptation could be, the city of somewhere near Dave there, Edinburgh, needs more water. I don't know whether it does or not. But anyway, we need to build another dam, a reservoir, to spread, because there's going to be less water. We need more power to cool nuclear power stations. We need more hydro. So it's hydro grid. We need more. So all the time, there's going to be more and more pressure as the climate changes to regulate rivers. So what about flooding? There's a lot of flooding now in parts of Ireland at the moment. I think in Scotland there recently, there was a serious, you were mentioning that, David. Joe, what are we going to do there? Well, the obvious thing, why don't we just drain the river? Why don't we lock it up, put up 3 big walls either side of it, and just drain that thing right into the sea? That's the end of your salmon. But so there are really, really hard societal choices to be made here. And it's about democracy and so on. So, Dara, I can feel your stress there, but this is where you're at.
Oh, don't get me started. I wanted to just, before we get on to the last question, I did want to move, and it's something we've kind of talked about, Jim, is just imagine the world where if you took angling away, if you took aquaculture away, right? And if you just let the salmon do their thing, right? But in the current context of climate change and the marine heat waves we're seeing, is that enough that what we're seeing is going to kill off the populations or severely severely
I think this is what the point Dave was making earlier. There is enormous adaptive capacity within these animals if you make everything right. The bit you've got control of here, freshwaters and so on, and the connection between the river and the sea and so on. That gives them some chance to adapt, to evolve, to match the environment that's at the sea. Now, what's going to mediate that is how quickly they change on the sea and their magnitude. And then, so that's more the global thing. That end will have to be resolved through whatever international treaties or whatever. But the bit that you're responsible, the freshwater bit, you need to look after that. And that entity, that portfolio of salmon populations that live in that. So it's the relationship between those two things. That gives you the chance for these animals to adapt. Like these animals have adapted before, like 15, 20,000 years ago, Britain and Ireland was covered in ice. There were no salmon. There is enormous capacity for those animals then to recolonize, to move as the ice pulled back and so on. And that dynamic will continue. So salmon may not go extinct, Joe, maybe will in more northern latitudes. But even in more northern latitudes, climate is going to have a massive effect too. Like
talking about the ice age and salmon, just there, I feel I have to put in my tiny bit of knowledge with regards to Atlantic salmon and ice ages. I'm reassuringly told by a scientist from Exeter University that actually the chalk stream salmon, because the ice flows only they didn't quite cover the south coast of England, and potentially that chalk stream subspecies has been there for millions of years, and sadly that species is so close to collapse right now that it's tragic. But it's interesting. It does tie into these things can and probably will come back. In what shape or form or where is we'll never know. But the doom and gloom is only, as far as nature goes, probably short term, right? It just happens to be on our watch.
I think the problem with this is that we're too tippy-tappy around it. Like, I want to hear, when I hear the United Nations saying that this is climate breakdown, we need to start hearing people saying this language that is so strong and hard-hitting that makes people go, oh, as opposed to if we say, oh, in 2100 things might be a bit hotter. People go, hey, that's grand.
It is something I do see as a bit of an irony. It's been quite clear to me for a long time that climate change or climate breakdown is definitely impacting on our fish, but it's something that really hasn't penetrated the angling psyche. In actual fact, I mean, some years ago, I remember a few years, just not very long, I remember talking to a guy who told me that climate change was just a huge hoax. A very keen angler. So it surprises me, as I say, why it is such a profound impact on our fish in terms of the average punter. So I get the impression that quite a lot of anglers are, I would say, climate skeptics or whatever, which is unfortunate. Not all, but there are. I think there is some degree of that. Whereas people really need to be taking this seriously.
I think we're all in agreement that cold, clean water, those three important words are the silver bullet, in as much as what we can control from our small corner of the world, and certainly the world of Atlantic salmon. And with that in mind, our final question, let's try and give it a little bit of levity on the way out. So assuming we do have cold, clean water and we've achieved it, and it might not be this year, it's some year hypothetically into the future, but we're all still here somehow. Firstly to you, because I know you're both anglers, Phil, if it was your last day on Earth and all the rivers had cold, clean water, what river would you fish and who would you take?
I'm going to go to a river that currently has cold, clean water, which is not too far from where I am now, up in the Old Duff. That is the most remarkable place. It is it's only a tiny river compared to the Tay, like small little thing. I don't know what, maybe 500 square kilometers of a catchment, but it has early run fish, late run fish, big fish, small fish, grills, the whole lot. So it just tells me there's a great portfolio of material in there. So that is a fantastic place. Who would I bring? I should bring you three guys with me. I think I show it all.
I'm there. That sounds amazing. Where was it again?
I can't. It's a secret. If you didn't pick it up the first time,
okay, fine. I'll just scrutinize
this.
What
angler would be giving away that kind of information?
Yeah, exactly. I was going, what are you doing, my friend? What are you doing? That's gold. Great. Thanks, Phil. And what about you, David?
Well, I suspect if it was my last day on Earth and I knew that, I probably wouldn't be so much bothered about going to somewhere where you might expect to get the biggest catches, but I would probably go to a small river called the Yugi in Aberdeenshire. It was a river nobody's ever, but it was one that I started fishing on when I was a kid. And I think that's where, I would go if because I had many happy days there as a child, seeing, and with a lot of people who were very excited when you saw salmon. I don't think they get much there now. It's not a great river. It's pretty agricultural, but that's where I would probably go.
Who would you go with?
Who would I go with? I suppose some of the pals who fished there when I was a kid too. I haven't seen for many years. I don't suppose any of them fish now, but it would be quite interesting to go back and see how things have changed. I remember some days that when we had a lot of fun
fishing with mates on your childhood river. It sounds ideal. Thank you so much for that. As we said to you, as we pointed out at the beginning of the conversation, both Dara and myself were very interested, in particular in this podcast, because there's so much conjecture and there's so much speculation and conversation around hatcheries, especially now more than ever, because people are clutching at straws and looking at them for perhaps the wrong reasons and for perhaps to be the ultimate solution. So this is one of the many reasons why we wanted you to on the show, was so that we could learn as much as possible in the time we've got. And I feel we really have learned a lot. Do you, Dara? I
think there is that danger kind of in the current context of the season that we've just had, people maybe rushing, clamoring for one solution that fits all, and that's not the case. And I think hopefully people will kind of understand that more from listening to you.
But having said that, David, keep up the great work. Because I'm sure I know you're making a difference. On that part and on the Gary.
Coming up in the next episode of The Last Salmon,
we're rounding it up, aren't we, Dara? We got Professor Ken Whelan. He's the godfather of the Atlantic salmon, I think. I've known Ken's work for years. I've been lucky enough to talk to Ken on and off the record before this. And what Ken, I guess, does in this episode is that he beautifully collates all the information that we've gleaned over the past 10, 11 hours from all our guests, and he wraps it up in a neat, succinct conclusion about actions to be taken, about the desperate situation that our salmon finds itself in. And he really, really is worth listening to.
We're at a stage now with some of our really valuable stocks where intervention is absolutely called for. I think we can't sit back any longer and think it's going to repair itself.
Listen and follow on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. And don't forget to give us your feedback, rate and review. We want to open up the salmon discussion to you.
Remember to keep in the fight for our salmon.